All right, we're live. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the 2022 International Open Seminar on Semiotics. This is a tribute to John Deely on the 5th anniversary of his passing. And whether you are watching us live now on YouTube or some other platform, or watching us after the fact, we would like to welcome you and thank you for joining us. This is a collaborative international open scientific initiative and a celebration which connects a network of dozens of personalities and organizations coming from various environments with different profiles, all working in unison towards the advancement and propagation of semiotic studies. Today's presentation is titled John Deely's Contributions to Biosemiotics. And we have, we're pleased to be joined by 3 different speakers, namely Professor Donald Favareau, Professor Paul Cobley, and Professor Kalevi Kull. And at the end of the presentation, there's a commentary that will be offered by Professor Anton Markoš. I would also like to mention briefly that, as always, we will we'll have a presentation here live for everyone, and as well as the commentary. And at the end, those of you who are with us here in the Zoom meeting will be invited to share commentaries or ask any questions, and so forth. So please stick around after the talk if you're here with us on Zoom. And so now I'm going to introduce all of the speakers together at once in the beginning, and then we'll just proceed through the talk so that we don't interrupt the flow. So first we have Professor Paul Cobley. As I mentioned, Professor Cobley is a professor in language and media and the Deputy Dean of Research and Knowledge Exchange in the Faculty of Arts and Creative Industries at Middlesex University. He is the co-series editor with Kalevi Kull of Semiotics, Communication, and Cognition. And he is the 9th Thomas A. Sebeok Fellow of the Semiotics Society of America. He's the president of the International Association for Semiotic Studies and the secretary of the International Society for Biosemiotic Studies. Donald Favareau is an associate professor at the University Scholars Program at the National University of Singapore. He received his degrees in philosophy and applied linguistics with particular interest in philosophy of mind and the neurobiology of language from the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. He became involved with the interdisciplinary research project of biosemiotics in 2001 and has been an active researcher and organizer of the field ever since. And he's also served as the vice president of the International Society for Biosemiotic Studies since its founding in 2005. Kalevi Kull is a professor of biosemiotics in the University of Tartu, Estonia. His research focuses on intersections of biology and semiotics. He studied biology and worked in theoretical biology and the field of ecology, while in the most recent decades in semiotics. His mission is to foster an ecological culture. And Professor Markoš, Anton Markoš, who will be again giving our commentary on the talk, is a theoretical biologist and associate professor at the Department of Philosophy and History of Science of the Faculty of Science, Charles University in Prague. In his writings, he focuses on cell and evolutionary biology, as well as biosemiotics from the hermeneutical, historical, and philosophical point of view. So with that brief and inadequate introduction, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our speakers.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Am I unmuted? Yes. Let me just take a moment to see that I can share the screen correctly. It looks to be okay. Yeah. All right. I'm Don Favareau, and I'm going to begin the presentation. Even though I'm certainly not the youngest in the room, I probably was the one who met John Deely last around 2003, 2004. Kalevi knows him quite a bit from the 90s, and Paul perhaps even before that. But what I want to do today in my part of the presentation is to give a very brief overview, kind of introduce to the audience the general ideas behind biosemiotics and talk about John's contributions, both in its founding and those contributions which I still think are very, as John would say, fecund for future development, the ongoing development of science. Okay. Let's click this. It doesn't seem to work, so I'll go this way. It doesn't seem to work either. All right, there we go. All right, so we all know who John Deely is. The question, of course, is for some of us, what is biosemiotics exactly? So among other things in the context today, it's a project that Deely was supportive of and helped develop from the beginning. If you look at this sample of biosemiotic titles, you'll notice I put Paul Cobley's book on John Deely here among these other classic biosemiotic texts. For as Paul makes the claim that one cannot really be literate in semiotics unless one is at least a dilettante in biosemiotics, I would make the further argument that one cannot really be literate in biosemiotics at least unless one is at least a dilettante in the works of John Deely. So in a very kind of simple way, I want to show some of the major, we're going to talk about some of the major contributions of John Deely to biosemiotics. I'll be speaking of his notion of supersubjectivity. Paul will talk about his distinction between sign, object, and thing. Kalevi will give some personal memoirs and perhaps touch on the point where John felt that biosemiotics, for all of its potential and all of its improvement over traditional natural science and traditional general semiotics, was still a midmost target. And we can talk about this in the discussion and our disagreements with John about the nature of what he came to call towards the end of his career, physiosemiosis. Okay? So that's a general overview of the kind of thing we'll be doing. So again, to summarize quite quickly, I think most people here are somewhat familiar with the field, perhaps very, but we don't know who will be watching on the video. In the old webpage for the International Society of Biosemiotic Studies, biosemiotics is defined as, fix my cursor here. It deals with sign processes in nature in all dimensions, including the emergence of semiosis in nature, which may coincide with or anticipate the emergence of living cells, the natural history of signs, the horizontal aspects of semiosis in the ontogeny of organisms, in plant and animal communication, and in lower sign functions in the immune and nervous system, and the semiotics of cognition and language. Biosemiotics can thus be seen as a contribution to a general theory of evolution involving a synthesis of different disciplines. It is a branch of general semiotics, but the existence of signs and its subject matter is not necessarily presupposed, insofar as the origin of semiosis in the universe is one of the riddles to be solved. And it's this little quote from Klaus Semeke, one of the founders of the contemporary project of biosemiotics. Again, we'll see its expression towards the end of the presentation. We're just going to briefly talk about John's contributions to biosemiotics and this question that Klaus poses at the end, this riddle of the emergence of signs. CBR claims coextensive with life. Biosemiotics, for the most part, agrees with that interpretation. And John, once again, towards the end of his life, felt there was more. All right, just on my screen here, and hopefully once I do this one last time, we'll be okay. All right. Okay, so I won't bore you. The history of biosemiotics in many ways, John was integral to it. He was involved in the beginning before it even had a name. Back in 1984, Merdine Anderson, Tom Sebiak, Joseph Ransdell, John Deely, and others put out a programmatic statement calling for the development of a semiotics that would provide the human sciences with a context for reconceptualizing foundations and for moving along the path which avoids crashing into the philosophical roadblock thrown up by the forced choices between realism and idealism, as though this exclusive dichotomy were also exhaustive of the possibilities for interpreting experience. Now, it's interesting, back in 1984, Tom is still talking here about the human sciences. But as we all know, he would take his sabbatical and undergo kind of a life changing, or at least by focusing deep study of animal communication, which resulted in many volumes. So the beginning of those semiotics, as John insisted we pronounce it correctly, in many ways were certainly, if not founded, but certainly highly instigated by Sebiac's work in this field, and in particular, his writings and his ability to bring around people from different disciplines, right? From animal communication studies down to cellular biology and into the human realms of languages and cognition. So again, John is at the beginning of this project. I would think that John would agree that this project maintains the spirit of opening up not just the human sciences, but also the natural sciences into ways of thinking beyond realism and idealism, right? A more nuanced understanding of the relations at play in the animal and the human world of being through signs. Now, for Sebiac, of course, one of his major accomplishments in developing this field was the rediscovery of the Baltic Estonian biologist, Jakob van Uxkel. And Sebiac turned to Uxkel, among others, for the all-important notion of the animal Umwelt, the subjective world that surrounds all living things that's been shaped in a recursive manner within a lineage by the history of its own prior perception-action pairings in the world. This has become also an integral part of John Deely's work in semiotics. Indeed, when I compiled what was supposed to be, to date, the definitive anthology about the contemporary project of biosemiotics, John was very insistent that his exegesis of Jakob van Uxkel's Umwelt notion appear in the volume. But for a number of contractual reasons, such as we're supposed to only include primary texts, we included instead Jakob van Uxkel's exegesis of Jakob van Uxkel's Umwelt theory. But John's remains one's worth reading. Okay? So what Uxkel is trying to get at is the being proper towards signs, right? The being that living organisms establish between their perceptual experience and their actions upon the world, and the way that these perceptual experiences come out of the biology of the being and change the biology of the being as it evolves through time and as it interacts with other beings. So for Uxkel, of course, he notes that the entire world of our perceptual experience, not just ours, but every living creature, everything that perceives, comes mediated always by the signs that our biology has made meaningful for our being. More importantly, as John reminds us constantly in his writing, the sign relations constituting an organism's perceptual domain comprise the Umwelt in which it chooses action. It's in accordance with the relations of this experiential world, and not the entirety of the whole unseen but physically existing world, that the creature has to coordinate its actions to flee, forage, eat, mate, and sustain itself. Now, it's easy to show there are countless examples of sign use in the animal world, sign use as a way of knowing the world, and sign use as a way of communicating in the world. And I think they're all fairly well established now, such that these are not something to even have to discuss anymore. Sign use is an organizing principle in the biosphere. It has consequences for the organism. And as we saw, their very actions, their very being emerges from this experiential constellation of relationships which constitute the Umwelt. Now, again, because I'm pitching this for people who might be tuning in from a naive point of view, we could go on and show many examples of such things. They're ubiquitous in nature. But I want to take 3 minutes to ask you to watch a typical documentary video about a particular set of relationships between two particular organisms in nature, and try to think about what issues this brings up. Okay, so I'll pause off for a minute and I'll put this on and ask you to pay attention to this.
Gull colonies in the Mediterranean, as anywhere else in the world, are busy, noisy places full of activity as parent birds come and go, tending their chicks. They're also messy, smelly places with droppings, misplaced bits of half-digested fish and dead bodies lying about all over the place. In short, for flies and ants, they are very heaven. And beside some gull colonies, you may find one of these. This is not an image of a sexy, seductive female animal. The mimicry is more gruesome. This is a bogus corpse, mimicking rotting flesh covered with hair and giving off the putrid smell of carrion. It's the dead horse arum. Blowflies find this highly attractive. They need to find a hole to get into a corpse, and this seems to be one. Within are a whole cluster of tiny flowers. Those at the top are male, but they're not yet ripe. Below is a barricade of spines, and below them, the female flowers. Some of the flies have already visited such a flower as this and are carrying cargoes of pollen. Down here, in a real corpse, they might have found succulent rotting flesh on which to feast and lay their eggs so that later their maggots could also feed. But they find nothing. As they continue to search, pollen brushes off them onto the stigmas. The spikes discourage them from getting out. By now it's getting dark and flies don't fly at night, they're stuck. During the night, the male flowers suddenly shed their pollen. And during the night too, the spikes of the barricade shrivel. So by the morning, the flies are free to go. And each takes with it a load of pollen from the male flowers.
And what I want to draw your attention to is, once again, it's easy to look at these kind of relations we saw before, where signals and signs are being exchanged from one organism to another that is biologically equipped to interpret those signs in ways that seem quite intuitive to us. When we look at this situation here with the dead horse arum, what we need to notice is that, and I'll take this, I'll leave it there for a moment. While the flies, we might be tempted to say, oh, their subjective experience is an organizing principle in the biosphere, because without those flies, the arum wouldn't be this particular way. It's even thermogenetically iconic of the kind of corpse that the fly is looking for indexically to lay its eggs. But this interpretation gets complicated when we start to think about the fact that for the plant, there's not even any way we can think of an intentionality towards the fly unless we change our understanding of the notion of intentionality. If we think of it as a mental image, if we think of it as a kind of mapping, there's no reason to believe that there's anything in the orchid itself aware in any sense, considering the object, as it were, of a blowfly. And yet the matching is what Uxku would call the contrapuntal duet is perfect. If the arum was not fly-like and the fly was not arum-like, the union could never be successful. What this illustrates is something beyond subjectivity, and we're using subjectivity in this normal term, not this technical Deely term, and beyond even intersubjectivity. It's pointing to the notion of supersubjectivity, right, as an organizing principle. in the biosphere, not any supersubjectivity, but a certain type of supersubjectivity that John talks about, which I'll show on the following slide, as a relational realis. Because remember, I think most of us know John's illustrative anecdote about the person who's going to meet another person for dinner and then gets hit by a car, and the other person, unaware of that, person A is still a terminus in that supersubjective relationship that exists over and above the both of them for that person waiting for them. Well, so too in a situation like this, in the absence of such flies, the being towards their flyness would still be in the plant at least for several generations. And for the flies themselves, as they go out in their being towards the world, the terminus that they seek is the type of thing that comes to them as what they experience here with this orchid. So it seems to me that this notion that John does a wonderful job of throughout his later work, beginning with 4 Ages, of supersubjectivity, and we all know John's categories. I just want to focus on these 3. The notion that being, right, being able to exist, takes place in itself, and also, these are not opposites, in or towards another. It's in and towards another for all living beings, right? The relation of supersubjectivity connecting the individual to what is other than itself, a deep connection, over and above any existing, the necessity of any particular individuals that can recognize that relation. The relationship in nature itself between the behavior of the flies and between the behavior and the morphology of the plant has become a genuine existent, a genuine relation, because of course for John, relations are existence. They're not just nominalistic posits. This actual being able to exist toward another, the supersubjectivity, can occur dependent on thought, which what he calls relatio rationis. That is my being towards Kalevi Kull, who right now I can't see, and yet he's a terminus of my idea of him. John will call these purely objective relationships, and Paul will talk a little bit about that. We talk about sign, object, and thing. But being towards another also exists independent of thought. And this he calls relatio realis, physical relations of intersubjectivity, relations that have come about that cannot be conceived other than with reference towards another. I think the quote from John I want to point out here is, in actual existence, every substance and every accident is maintained by realities of circumstances and being other than itself. Relation, as a distinct category then, would comprise all and only those features of being towards another which cannot, even by abstraction, omit reference towards. Now in biosemiotics, when we start with the living organism, the simplest living organisms, the one thing we can say about living systems, we feel fairly confident, seems to be not contradicted, is that even in the simplest ones, matter and energy become used to build and maintain a structure that defines the system as somewhat distinct from its environment. The relationships within the organism are built out of the same type of physical and chemical relationships outside of it, but are organized in a new way, organized in indirected ways that happen to keep the organism in being. This structure in turn utilizes incoming matter in specific and directed self-perpetuating ways. So in the theories of the origin of life, you'll see these autocatalytic reactions, which are self-sustaining in ways that don't require any kind of perception or any kind of semiosis. Right? On the physical chemical matter, one can, in a very kind of complex organizational scheme, come up with a system that keeps itself in being without signs. It's keeping itself in being in its substrate by taking things from outside and putting them together in certain ways. Once that substrate starts to disappear, this thing cannot stay in being. What we find from what we know of the very earliest systems is that for a system to move into a new environment, to move into a new substrate, such that, among other things, more of what it needs to be is there, its being can continue, it needs to have a being towards another. It needs to develop perceptual apparatus, right, to find what it needs in the external world beyond itself. This is the very beginning of the semiotic relationship. between the organism and the world. So in this sense, perception, from the Latin to seize, are sensations that have become functionally or meaningfully arranged. In other words, the establishment, discovery, and negation of signs. And we see this basic relation, which itself is founded upon the relations of supersubjectivity right at the earliest living systems that we know of or even can hypothesize. Of course, this is far before things like teleception, sight, sound, hearing, right? But it's the same notion. Even if the organism is doing a random walk, there is still those moments when a certain type of iconic fitting takes place such that this becomes incorporated into the organism and the other one doesn't. So rather than to talk about subjectivity alone being an organizing principle in nature, which we can think about in one sense when we talk about higher order organisms and the way they live together in ecosystems, I think John shows us is that supersubjectivity is an organizing principle, or at least the existence of such relations as real relations and not just nominalisms. John writes, the classical medieval definition of a relation is that whose whole being consists in a reference or being towards another is intended to convey Aristotle's idea of relation as verifiable under a distinct category of physical being. This is part of what grounds the realism of animal and human relations in the world and makes possible a world of what John will call objective experience, everyone else in the world would call subjective experience, and our efforts as animals and as human researchers to have some kind of real veridical access to the world that we can speak of. Real enough, real in the Persian sense. It will situate us within the world, no matter what that world is like in itself, and ideally, we'll come to know more and more of it. So, to conclude, to be towards the other, spelled incorrectly, an intentional being, whether mind-dependent or not mind-dependent, what Terry Deacon would call an intentionality, is precisely to assimilate vicariously the form of the other, not in its substantial form, not in mental image of the fly, right? But aspects of its being and its activity conveyed initially through environmental interactions. This assigns the relationships that have been established in the world themselves, which come to the organism as signs. Of course, the organism and its biology, its lineage, has been causal in establishing those relationships. But once established, again, can rely on those relationships as real enough parts of being to orient to. So, Carl West, one of the major thinkers of biology, redid our notion of the evolutionary kingdom. Says that biology today is no more fully explanatory in principle than physics was a century or so ago. In both cases, the guiding vision had or has reached its end. And in both, a newer, deeper, more invigorating representation of reality was or is called for. In John's Forage of Understanding and in all of his work, he points the way to us to get past modernity, to get past the denial of the sign that happens in modernity and to bring it back, to start understanding in relations and the relations of the natural world in a different, more grounded way, where the sign is a real, has a real relation in the world, has a real existence in the world, its own particular kind of being that is particular to the sign, and I would even say to the sign of the living organisms. When I organized my essential readings in Biosemiotics, I did so according to John's scheme: the antiquity of science, natural science more or less before signs, the medieval development in Coimbra and elsewhere, of a fuller sign theory, the complete denial and abandonment of sign theory as signs, qua signs in modernity, and what John calls us to in Biosemiotics, which is the recovery of the medieval notion of the sign and its development in light of more recent discoveries and understandings. Okay, so guided by John's brilliant explication of supersubjective relations, the distinction between object and thing that Paul will next talk about, and the notion on which we and John, we're friends to the end, and by we, I mean John and the biosemiotic community. John was is well respected in the biosemiotics community, and John supported biosemiotics throughout it. But again, as radical as biosemiotics seems to others, John thought we were yet not too radical because we wouldn't take the step beyond life, right? Those relationships that exist prior to the organism, bringing them into sign relationships, how are we to think of them? John wants us to think of them as proto-semiosis or potentially semiotic for reasons that we'll probably discuss in the Q&A, maybe Kalevi will touch on. We find that formulation problematic and not necessary for the doing of our kind of biology. It can be argued. I'm sure all of this will be argued. So I want to hand it over to Paul, and just on the 5th anniversary of his passing, I remember John's words that to be for nature is to be intelligible for the animal whose being is to understand. That's it. Okay, and now I'll hand it over to Paul. Paul, you may share the screen at your will. You're muted, Paul.
After all these years, I should be used to Zoom. Thanks indeed, Don, for this. I mean, just a very preliminary thing to say, and that is I'm delighted to be here amongst friends. I'm delighted to participate in this series, this long series of talks devoted to John Deely, which is in its length completely warranted, I believe. I was thinking a little bit just as Don was talking that, you know, perhaps really, and I think it's borne out towards the end of what Don said, the title that we have for this session, John Deely's contribution to biosemiotics, in a way it's a bit of a misnomer. Anton and Don and Kalevi might disagree, but for me, biosemiotics, in a sense, is an exemplification of John's project. It's something that that he saw as, in its early institutionalization, realization of some of the ways in which, from the 1984 article onwards, he wanted to reorientate semiotics as a whole. I'm referring to the article with Anderson and Seebjörk and others that Don instanced in the early part of his paper. If anyone is here who attended Deely's presentation of his Umwelt essay that came out in a number of forms, but he presented that 22 years ago in Finland, you will remember quite well just how driven he was, how connected with biosemiotics, and how behind that project he was from that particular presentation alone. I can remember that drive above all. I also remember that these were the early days. Somebody in the audience had a mobile phone that went off, and as it was ringing, John said, "If that's for me, tell them I'm busy." So those are my memories of that. Also, as a preliminary, I should say something about the title of, the putative title of what I'm about to present here: sign, object, and thing. That sounds a little bit like a discussion of the ontology of the sign, almost in a way, particularly in John Deely's recasting of those words and the associations of them. It might seem like the kind of focus that we have become used to through analytic philosophy. And John, of course, was dead against analytic philosophy for reasons which are abundant throughout his work. But nevertheless, he was a philosopher, but a philosopher not necessarily in the mainstream or in the usual sense that we would think of somebody doing philosophy, although he could mix that with anybody. He could compete with anybody on that. John Deely, to my knowledge, never ever lost an argument, and one of the reasons that I'm so sad about his passing is that I often find myself in positions where I'm about to lose an argument, and I wish I could bring John on to win the argument for me, because I know that he would. Yes, to come back to Coimbra as well, John's work on the late Latins in some ways dovetailed with that of Catholic philosophy, but I think that he was trying to do something else. He's doing something more than Catholic philosophy, and I think that something else is very much in the direction of biosemiotics and reorientating general semiotics so that it could be understood that the basis of general semiotics is biosemiotics, and the basis, if we wanted to look at it like this, of biosemiotics is sign, object, and thing. John was interested in these issues from a very early stage. For those of you who know his work a little bit, you'll know that his first article was this humongous piece of work on Darwinism and on a close reading of Dobzhansky in particular. So it's a long-held interest of his, not something that he developed only after he met Semiotic. So thinking about this issue of sign, object, and thing being the basis of biosemiotics, and therefore forming the frame for general semiotics. This is not to say that general semioticians are not free to continue doing the semiotics of purely human phenomena. Much work has come out of that, and it's been very good, and much work can continue to be done in that sphere. But I think for John, denying that the natural world is beyond the concerns of semiotics, it's a little bit like an architect denying that the material of buildings, even those built from seemingly synthetic materials, ultimately have no organic basis. As anyone who's made concrete knows, you need water, organic, you need shingle, organic, you need sand, organic, and you need concrete powder, which ultimately is organic, but it's it's a synthetic material. So let me share the screen, because I want to come to this issue of sign, object, and thing. And in particular, I want to refer back to Don's presentation, where at the end we started to talk about mind-dependent and mind-independent being. And I have a few quotes, so that, it's best to let John speak in these circumstances, but I'll try and offer some gloss on these quotes in order to orientate them to the question that we have for this seminar as a whole. So this is the relation of logic to semiotics. John says, the analysis of sign, semiotic, provides a point of view that is superior to, that literally transcends the traditional vision of being into what is independent of the mind, ons reale, and what is dependent upon it, ons rationis. Because in the sign, as in experience, both orders of being are found. Okay, so this is particularly useful and particularly interesting in the present circumstances, and Don was absolutely right to introduce it. There is still some debate of the extent to which ons reale is part of non-human animal or non-human organisms' existence, but generally we will see in the notion of sign, object, and thing a particular perspective on human exceptionalism that Deely was able to furnish us with, and that's because of his insistence that although there are these two realms of being, the human in particular shifts back and forth between them in a way which philosophers have not got to grips with over millennia. And then mind independent and mind dependent being, again, this is from Defining the Semiotic Animal, the first draft of his book from 2010. That's the title, Semiotic Animal, and I'm going to just reduce that a little bit. Yes, Semiotics recovers the ons reale insisted upon as knowable by scholastic realism. Yet at the same time, Semiotics demonstrates the objectivity of ons rationis in the social construction of species-specific realities among biological organisms. With this twofold accomplishment, Semiotics manifests the distinctiveness of cultural reality in the human species as the locus where the differences between ons reale and ons rationis become knowable and distinguishable as such consequent upon the human grasp of ons primum cognitum. Okay, so this grows into Deely's argument about the semiotic animal, but hopefully the point that I made before is clear here, that there's, in the human, there's the constant shifting between a mind-independent reality, you know, the world of things, the world of objects and other entities that are outside the human mind, and mind-dependent being, which is very much mind-orientated, things that are in the mind. Now, if we have that sense, then this ontological issue of sign, object, and thing becomes much more easy to negotiate. So let's go to his work from 1994, which very much is a work of philosophy. It's a series of numbered theses for the entire book. But a crucial part early on, there's this sequence on sign, object, and thing. And Deely says, there are signs, and there are other things besides. Things which are unknown to us at the moment, and perhaps for all of our individual life, things which existed before us, and other things which will exist after us, things which exist only as a result of our social interactions, like governments and flags, and things which exist within our round of interactions, like daytime and night, but without being produced exactly by those interactions, or at least not in as much as they are ours, i.e. springing from us in some primary sense. Now, I think we get a strong idea of the thing in this quote, you know, and it's a real problem because, you know, it's called a thing, which is an item in common parlance, but the thing is unknowable, and that's, you know, that's common in a lot of philosophy, that there are references to the thing. But what is biosemiotic about that? Well, I think that what's biosemiotic has been prefigured a little bit in Don's talk, but it also requires an understanding of what sign and object are. And there's a massive reorientation that goes on here. This is one of the reasons why Deely's challenging, and he wouldn't step back on this. And that is that things are available to humans, okay? They don't remain completely mysterious and unknowable in 100% of their existence. They're knowable in a small sense, okay? And they're knowable as what he would call objects. That's to say, you might encounter a thing if you were an organism, and that thing, easiest I always think to imagine it as a piece of extraterrestrial rock, not something that's sapient in any way or sentient. You might encounter that, and insofar as you were able to encounter it and experience aspects of it, you are furnished with an object. Okay, so there's a distinction there between thing and an object. And that the reason I think that that's a little bit difficult to grasp, not as a concept, but as a configuration to place in the history of philosophy, is that the subject-object couplet usually refers to some kind of objective reality on the one hand, and then something that's completely mind-dependent or subjective. But you remember, Deely insists on the oscillation between the two, and the oscillation between the two must be facilitated in some way, and it's facilitated in this this three-step arrangement that he has between the things that we consider unknowable and the objects that we experience that allow us some knowledge of the things. But then, okay, and paramount in this is the conception of sign. And what sign does in particular is it allows a world of association, which is added in layers and layers on top of an object. And certainly, you know, an object extracts from and allows layering of itself in respect of an original thing. So in a way, this isn't a perfect analogy, but in a way, the old adage about the tip of the iceberg, in some respects, is true if you think of sign being the tip of the iceberg. So let me just come back to something which I hope will act as a segue here for Kalevi's discussion. And apologies. Here we go. This is a quote on relation. Okay, so we're going back to the notion of suprasubjectivity, and also looking forward a little bit to the notion of physiosemiosis. So according to the Latin tradition of thought, relation involves three basic elements: what they call the foundation, or ground in our terms, some characteristic of an individual, the relation itself, which is over and above the individual, supra and intersubjective, we would say, and that to which the thing is related through its foundation, which they call the term or terminus of the relation. Or if we wanted to put it another way, a relation between two gargoyles is still a relation, even though there be no gargoyle substances. But in order for gargoyles to be substances, there must be gargoyles possible to exist independently of finite mind. And I think if I was summarizing in the most succinct possible way, and thinking about this as a contribution to biosemiotics, in particular thinking about the issue that we sometimes have to deal with in considering evolution and considering the possibility of human exceptionalism in a biosemiotic sense, not in the more theological sense, then the idea that the human is able to A, recognize that there are such things as signs, and B, conceive of unknowable entities or unknowable qualities. I think that's in some ways the major contribution, if we're calling it a contribution. I think it's more of a conception of the field, conception of semiotics and conception of biosemiotics. But if it's a contribution to biosemiotics, then I would say succinctly that that's where it lies. Okay, so many thanks for listening. I hope that's a good segue to Kalevi, but you judge when you begin to talk.
Thank you, Paul. Let us try to
want to share the whole screen or just a
I
portion?
want to share
The
screen.
whole thing or just a portion?
Whole.
Then go to basic. Here, let me do it.
Yes. Now it's this. Full screen from where?
Just hit
See.
exit.
True, right. Okay, and now whether the screen will. Do you see there are two guys? Right. John Deely has been one of the giants of semiotics, and in this photo together with Umberto Eco during the last encounter in Tartu in 2009. My first meeting with John Deely was in 1990s, probably in Toronto at the meeting Semiotics, Evolution, Energy.
We are sorry, Professor. We are stuck in the first slide.
Do you see
No,
two men on the slide?
no.
No.
Okay, then let's,
Here, let me do it.
one moment.
Why don't you do this, Kalevi? Try this. Or if we can. Which one? This one? This one, okay. Okay, go backwards two.
Not from here, this.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Buddy, want to give us a hand here?
Just try to change the. Moving.
Yes.
Yes. Excellent. Yeah. Let us then. I knew some Deely's work before I first met him, and was interested particularly because he has written a little bit about plants. One of very few semioticians who at that time was written about phytosemiotics, semiotics of plants. So when there was a coffee break, I approached him during the conference and started a discussion on phytosemiosis, explaining him at once that we should focus on the growth movements of plants and not on the whole plants, and not on the whole plants communication. But he, to my big surprise, didn't show any interest in plants. Instead, he changed the topic into physiosemiotics. So I had to ask him 2 times whether it's really not phytosemiotics, but physiosemiotics. And he, confirmed and said that that is the important thing to focus on. So that was the beginning of our discussions about the beginning of semiosis, a discussion which has lasted until, I would say, this day now, without arriving through agreement yet. John held the view that before semiosis appeared even on Earth, I would say, it had to exist already in some potential form. So John did not agree with Thomas Sebeok's statement that life and semiosis are coextensive, despite of the fact at the same time that, according to John, Sebeok was one of the most important semioticians of all times. So here, John is in Bloomington at Sebeok's garden at Thomas Sebel's grave. I happened to spend much time together with Deely. In 2008, I worked 3 months in Houston, and in next semester in 2009, Deely spent a whole semester in Tartu. Despite of our long discussions, Deely's view didn't change much. However, there was, according to my observation, still anyhow a little shift. And first, he distanced clearly himself from pansemiotics, from the view that there is semiosis everywhere, including in simply anorganic processes. But one of the closest models we arrived, which we could almost share, was that with the origin of life, what happened that semiosis simply became permanent. That before the true origin of life, there could have been separate short-term flashes that did not last long, temporary flashes of semiosis. But somehow the difference between life and non-life in terms of biochemistry didn't interest John at all, I would say. On the other hand, John was much interested in biological evolutionary theory when studying already in Dominican University in Chicago. However, later he rather saw one and the same basis for evolution, both in inorganic and organic world, that I would say is not compatible with the usual biologists' view on evolution. So together with Don and Paul, we published a brief account of Deely's work on biosemiotics, where we found to mention 8 points. Briefly, let me list these 8 points of Deely's contribution now more directly to biosemiotics. First, a view of, actually, in the very beginning of his academic writing, he wrote a large two parts paper about the origin of species, about the concept of species. Then he participated in a groundbreaking collective manifesto together with Murdin Andersson, Martin Kramp, and Joseph Ronstels, Thomas Sebel, and Ture von Uexküll in early 1980s, which made an important statement about the inclusion of communication processes in the whole sphere of life and into semiotics sphere, and acted as a template for contemporary biosemiotics. Then elaboration of views on biosemiotics in the chapters he included into basics of semiotics. There is a chapter on zoosemiotics, and there is a chapter on phytosemiotics. Then his writings about Umwelt, Paul mentioned, and also Don mentioned about those, where he tried to nuance and elaborate the concept, relating it also to concepts of Innenwelt and Lebenswelt, and elaborate in the way it could be included into general semiotic theory. Then he has a whole book on the concept of intentionality as a feature of living systems in general. Of course, very important concept for him, it's the concept of semiotic animal, through which he emphasized and described the role of semiotic threshold that makes us human. And then analysis of fundamental analysis of history of semiotics, which has been instructive for understanding the development of semiotic approach to living systems as applied in the context of biosemiotics and its history by Don Favareau. And then his permanent emphasis on defining semiotics in that way that would include biosemiotics and gives it an important role in semiotics as a whole. So main thing I would say to say about John Deely is his belief into the importance of semiotics. Importance of semiotics not only for understanding the history of philosophy, importance of semiotics for human knowledge as such, importance of semiotics for future of human knowledge. John's whole work can be seen as an argument for the importance of semiotics, probably one of the longest arguments ever written as such. And then with his deep enthusiasm and energy, he indeed did much for semiotics with his rewriting the history of philosophy from the semiotic point of view, but also practically with helping the Semiotic Society of America and its publications to go well, and also introducing biosemiotic direction of thinking in not only North America, but also importantly there. And with encouraging colleagues to do semiotics as much as possible. And now let me add few photos from John Deely's travel. This is the entrance to that university college where he studied, Dominican University in Chicago. And inside there, one of rooms, which was we made together a trip from Houston to Chicago and back by car, and so he just showed these places what were important in his life. He lived and taught over 20 years philosophy in Dubuque, Iowa, and that's the house. Half of it was owned by him, where he lived at that time, and also he expected that Iowa area is where he would stay forever, but life changed a little that expectation. Anyhow, here you see himself with his prospective future, with a writing on that coming from one of his mentors. Well, John, I must say, you are not always right and not always wrong, but never uncertain. Here, John with his wife, Brooke, and with some of his friends, Nordine Anderson, West Lafayette, Don Favareau, Paul Cobley, computer, and yeah, he really loved animals. Cat belonging to or living at Murdin Anderson's house. At home in Houston, the kitchen and in the living room. Actually, usually that table was full of papers where John was writing. Well, on rare cases, it was cleaned up when there were some guests. Then the University of St. Thomas, where John Deely worked in 2000s, and just that building where his office was. And that's his office table of everyday writings. With background, you can see on the wall him as a young man together with old Jacques Maritain. And one poster from his office, the main poster actually. And John was really very happy to have been found the sign of the sign. He tried to find logo or Semiotic Society of America, and say caduceus, the sign used by heralds, so the carriers of message, was really a very nice idea for that, actually proposed by Brooke, John's wife. John himself, sign of semiotics. So thank you from here.
Thank you, gentlemen. So I think at this point, we're going to turn it over to Professor Markoš for his commentary.
Yes, somehow I'm supposed to give to make a feedback and ask the speakers what I see in John Deely's the most important things in John Deely's work, and this is, I think, the word super subjectivity. I learned much from him, but this thing, the relation of two things, one of which should be perceiving, and if perceiving, it must be living, is I think a crucial input to my thinking. And then I was very surprised when reading his books that he was so hesitant to allow other living beings, but humans and perhaps higher animals, to enter the band of this perceiving things. If biosemiotics, I think it concerns all life. And so I am struggling all the time with this because of course my goal is to broaden his teaching to all life. So can you please comment why he was so hesitating to allow even plants, not speaking of bacteria, into the realm of all of semiotic beings who can do and who can be terminus of this subjective relation. Can you please maybe Paul may comment on the thing? You are muted. Paul. Paul, you are muted.
Yes, again, sorry. Yeah, I can start us off. I think I was quite surprised when I hadn't heard that story of Kalevi's before, where John refused to speak about phytosemiosis, because he absolutely insisted on it, and he was a great admirer of Martin Krampen, who had written about phytosemiosis, and I think he liked the Tartu essays on mushrooms, for example. So he was interested in that realm, as far as I understand. But of course, you know, he was interested in other things as well. For me, without being overly programmatic, I hope, I think you've picked out the right thing. I think super subjectivity is absolutely crucial, because it's so fundamental, and because it's so comprehensively misunderstood by everybody. I find myself, as you know, there are lots of enemies of semiotics for various reasons out there. And one of the ways that I try to win the argument in a Deely fashion is by referring to supersubjectivity, which people tend to think is just over and above. But it's not just a matter of being over and above and establishing the sign as real in some way, but it's actually a central concept for biosemiotics, because it's what binds everything in the sphere of the living together. So I think that is true. Sign, object, and thing, I think, is important. If you take a direction in biosemiotics, or a direction with a cue from Deely's work, that is interested in what species do, and you know, how species orientate towards the world. So yes, I think that he was interested in the entirety of existence, entirety of what we're interested in biosemiotics. But probably he didn't feel that he had the expertise in phytosemiotics. He needed a botanist to do that work. But I think that he was committed to it, particularly after reading that Krampen essay so many years ago. Kalevi, Dom?
Thanks. Yeah, I'm going to take a moment to expand on Anton's notion of the centrality of supersubjectivity. Of course, at the end of one's talks, I shouldn't have, that was the bad example. Just try to thought of a better way to talk about it. There's two main ways, symbolized by Paul and myself, perhaps, to think about biosemiotics. Both are correct. John and Paul and Tom Sebiak envisioned a semiotics that encompasses far more than biological relationships. Of course, they'll be in there, but that's not one of the main goals of biosemiotics. I agree with that, absolutely. Anton and Kalevi are biologists, and I'm a troublemaking philosopher of biology. And the problem of the issue of supersubjectivity is it's needed for biology, and it's washed out of biology. When the fly is born, it goes, it has an instinct. What is an instinct? It is the animal is born with a being towards certain behaviors, a being towards certain things. Are these things instantiated through material and efficient relationships? Of course they are. Peirce says this himself. You cannot have a manifestation towards final causality, or maybe even formal causality, without the efficient and material causation. Science, biology, wants to rule that out. You can't really talk about it. The animal does this for this reason. No. The animal does this and this happens. This organ is for something. The contortions biology twists itself in to get around the acknowledgement that among the relationships shaping living being are relationships of being towards another. Instantiated materially, yes. Instantiated with efficient causation, yes. But to pretend that it's all efficient material causation all the way down, without formal causation, without final causality, flies in the face of everything we know about living systems and their being in the world. So if John Deely did nothing else for biology, I would say he at least made the terms of this discussion sensible and for us to develop in ways that can be understood and accepted by biologists. And if that happens, biology will change. So to make an intervention in biology is one of the two main goals of biosemiotics and the focus of, I would say, Anton and Kalevi and myself.
Okay, Kalevi, would you like to add something?
Well, okay, one problem what John said up to the end of his life, that he still doesn't understand finally, well, not completely. That's the problem of what is relation. And so this is related now here too. But no, of course, say he included phytosemiotics. That's not the question. But somehow there just he didn't use much examples from biological sphere, and it's also understandable as being philosopher first of all. So that's actually a little nuance here. But anyhow, in all discussions where we are speaking about plants, actually he just goes next. His statement is that that's not the beginning.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. And now I think I will open the discussion for everybody who would like to say something to the topic. Please.
If I may suggest, Anton, we have a room of, I would say, mostly Deely skeptics here in presence. So perhaps you can go to the online presenters first, and then we'll take this very hostile gang that is looking at me and Kalevi with not a lot of evolutionary love.
So just to jump in here real quickly. So we'll stop the live broadcast. So we'll go off air, and everyone here at the Zoom is free to stick around and ask questions or add commentary.